anytime we're talking about the security and risk management of an organization, it really gets into the devil is in the details. And so as we go through and enumerate all of the stack of curriculum throughout this week, you'll see a lot come back to the security and risk management. As you would imagine, in our business, that's what we do. We do risk management. And so there's some definitions that we need to make sure everybody is aware of, and they're shown up here on the screen. So an asset, what is the valuation of that asset, what a threat is, a vulnerability, what's the exposure of that, and then what is the way that the bad guys can actually take advantage of those issues. We want to figure out what the assets are. Usually this is something that we request when we engage a customer. We usually will get an inventory, and that inventory is usually about as up to date, last 6 months, sometimes a couple of years. So we never know what we're getting with that. In addition, we can also request a network topology diagram, and that's usually not very frequently updated as well. So network topology diagram. And so what we do is we take what they have, we figure out how much it's worth, and then we come up with scenarios based off of what we know to be true in the business. And from that, we can calculate what the risk is. And so the risk is calculated by the threat times the vulnerability. We can come up with a matrix that I'll show you here in a second that has the likelihood as well as the impact of that. And typically, we see that in what's called a risk matrix. And that's in the form of a heat map, typically, where it's kind of like a traffic light system. If you plot things on the risk matrix, it's got a low likelihood and a low impact, so that's probably in green. Whereas I'll show you here in a few minutes, the high impact, high likelihood would be a red, and it would probably be blinking saying, we need to fix this as soon as possible. The mitigation, you probably already know. The residual risk is something that typically people don't know that it's actually called that. In tablature form and an artifact, we'll usually put the residual risk in a POAM. So it's what remains after we've already mitigated stuff, what's left over. In addition to that, what we're going to try to do is try to figure out ways that we can come up with these two terms, quantitative and qualitative. We'll come back to that here in a second. We typically will do this thing called the business impact analysis. And usually that involves, because by that point we already know what the assets are, how much they're worth, and we'll take what the assets are worth and what risk reduction needs to be done, and we'll do that CBA between the two to see if we actually can afford it, if it's worth it, and if not, then we figure out if we need to transfer it, if we need to mitigate it, if we need to avoid it, or just accept the risk. And on the commercial side of the house, I can tell you that sometimes customers will just accept risk if they don't have the money to implement it. How will we be able to figure this out? Well, one way is to do what's called a quantitative risk assessment. Quantitative risk assessment. And so check this out, because you will absolutely see this on the exam. So quantitative risk assessment here, if you're taking notes, I'm just going to put it in here. Quantitative is usually numbers or money or some sort of data. Quantitative risk analysis. So I think of, obviously the word here, and I don't want to placate you, but, quantity, I think of these, numbers, money, data. So anything that you can, come up with metrics on, typically that is a quantitative risk analysis. And so we have these things that we typically will do with quantitative risk analysis that deals with data. And you see them right here on this slide. One is this thing that's called the single loss expectancy. Another one is the annualized rate of occurrence, which means, how many times in a year that it's going to happen. So I want to show you something here as we go through and do this. If you just kind of take a look here at how this happens, we would need to have some interesting things. So the annualized rate of occurrence, usually this is a 0, meaning that it will never happen, to a 1.0, which is 100% in a year, or greater than 1%, which means that it can happen multiple times in a year. Based off of the annualized rate of occurrence, we can make a calculation on how much something would happen on an annual basis. So the single loss expectancy, asset value by the exposure factor, what is actually going to happen. And you can see down here, no loss to complete loss is similar to the annualized rate of occurrence, which basically another way to think about this is the frequency. The annualized rate of occurrence is the frequency. And usually that's in a percentage. Whereas the exposure factor is no loss to complete loss or multiple times that it's happening altogether. And so by understanding this, we can quickly try to come up with information that's meaningful. That's the quantitative risk assessment. Whereas the qualitative risk assessment is the opinion-based or scenario-driven. And so this is where we get subject matter experts that come in and tell us, based on my experience, I think this is what's going to happen. So a lot of times you lean on a combination of these two. So some quantitative, some qualitative, which it ends up being a semi-quantitative. But for purposes of your exam, the difference or the delta between these two is opinion-based and scenario-driven is qualitative risk assessment. And that's typically done by subject matter experts. So in this particular case, what can't be numerically proven, so statistics and data, we have to provide different scenarios for doing this. Typically what we do, and we do it very, very well, is it's a form of qualitative risk assessment in the form of a tabletop exercise. And so we do this with the Department of Homeland Security and some of the organizations in or around town. And so, we come up with scenarios, and then we walk through that scenario and storyboard it and figure out ways that we can mitigate that if that was to rise. Another thing that you typically will see on your exam is this right here, Delphi technique, the Delphi technique. And this Delphi or Delphi technique, that some of you guys might pronounce it a little bit differently, but usually this is where you try to come up with a way that everything is analyzed and a consensus is reached. What does that mean? Usually this is done via an anonymous vote with subject matter experts that allows them to basically give you an idea of why they think something should happen. And then, being anonymous, it's harder to bribe somebody and see what the way they voted. We used to use this, the Delphi technique at NASA for making architectural changes. And so at a super high level, that's the difference between the two. We can plot these onto the results onto a risk matrix. And the risk matrix gives us a chance to show whoever we're delivering the report to something that is meaningful. Over here, you can see you have the consequence or the impact, and then the likelihood. So let's say that we do that threat model that we did before, and the threat model comes in, and we on this risk matrix, we go ahead and we plot the top one that, hey, it's minimal impact and rare likelihood for it to happen based off of our, analysis that we did. Whereas if it comes into a severe and almost certain, it would be up here in the red area. But you can kind of see, I said earlier, like a traffic light system. Usually it's broken down the middle here where, stuff over here, you don't really got to worry about. Here in the middle, you definitely, it should be on your radar. This stuff up here, you got to fix it. You got to fix it. So let me give you even a better example here, because, everybody's got an opinion about something, right? The qualitative. So we talked about subject matter experts. I think of, my mom lives in Madeira Beach, and her condo is right on the beach or right on the water. And, a week and a half ago, she was 3 feet underwater. Her condo was 3 feet underwater. And so I think about hurricanes growing up in the state of Florida, and how typically when these hurricanes, there's one coming like from the Yucatan right now that looks like it's going directly back for the Tampa region where I'm from. But you can kind of see, some of these that have been in the past. I've just kind of plotted them on, or I took this from the internet and plotted them on here. But this is called the spaghetti model whenever it deals with one particular hurricane. And a lot of these are, engines based off of data. So it's a semi-quantitative, but also qualitative risk assessment, because then the Jim, Cantori, the dude that's always right in the middle of the eye for the Weather Channel, even though he sees that spaghetti model starting to look like, whatever, he's going to go to where he thinks it's going to be. And I mean, homeboy usually is right, So you can look at the data and make an educated decision, but ultimately, based off of your experience and what your gut tells you, you may want to make some inferences there as well. And so typically, insurance industry uses these types of matrices to figure out if there's 14 named storms, we keep the premium the same as last year. If there's 15 named storms, we jack the premium up, $500 extra a month, just to give you kind of a lame example of why we would go through and use this. Yeah, and so when you're doing a risk assessment, really you do what we typically will call is a gap assessment. And we try to come up with ways that the organization can reduce those risks. Really, this one down here is what everybody wants to do. They want to avoid it as much as possible. So that either kicks the can down the road 180 days, which a lot of organizations do. They try to just avoid it, hopefully it'll just go away by itself. Or they figure out a way to do one of these others right here. And so usually for purposes of your exam, there'll be one question on the exam for the risk responses. And then usually you'll have one question on what's the difference between a qualitative risk assessment and a quantitative risk assessment. And usually one question on this right here. Hold on, right here. Right here, where you have to either calculate the SLE or the ALE. And I'm going to show you how to do that tomorrow morning.